Seems like my experience from the past when we were under this traditional format was that if you taught on Sunday morning, a lot of times there didn't seem to be a lot of participation. Because I always kind of deduced that we're still sort of waking up on Sunday morning, you know. Whereas Wednesday night, when we come in here, by the time you get here at 7 o'clock, I'm pretty sure this is the case with the kids' classes. Of course, it may apply to Sunday morning too. They're really wound up because they've been at school all day, and then, you know, they come in here, and it seems as though on Wednesday night we may be more awake as well. But then I also look at the first class in this format every Sunday morning as an opportunity to wake everybody up, so that by the time we get to worship, we're actually sort of like the class has been a springboard where we may use a sports term, we're fired up by that time. So hopefully that's...
By the way, you got a blanket I can borrow?
Do I have a blanket you can borrow? Are you cold?
I'm scared.
Let's bow our head and we'll have a word of prayer. Our Holy Father, we're so thankful for this, another Lord's Day. We're thankful for a good night's rest, and we're thankful for the time we have now to study from the book of Joshua. We ask you to bless these efforts in Jesus' name. Amen. Chapter divisions in the Bible. That was of man. Somewhere around 1280, a man by the name of Stephen Langton divided the Bible into chapters. And that helps sometimes, and sometimes we may notice that that doesn't necessarily help. For example, as we were finishing up Joshua 5 last week, and I was getting you to look regarding this man who Joshua stands before, who has his sword drawn. As we read through that, even if I had never picked up on that before as far as, okay, that's no ordinary man, because there's something holy about the ground that this man is standing on, so much so that Joshua was told to put off his shoes like Moses was when he stood before the same person, capital P, in the form of a burning bush. But if there were no chapter divisions there, and if you had never thought about that before, you might pick up on what Alex kind of noted for us. Remember, this has happened. This man is standing over against him in verse 13 with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him, and he said, Art thou for us or for our adversaries? Remember, they are just somewhere he is near Jericho, verse 13. And he, this man, said, Nay, but as prince of the house of Jehovah. I look at that term, and that is another way of saying the angel, capital A. The angel of Jehovah. But he continues, But prince of the host of Jehovah am I now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth, and did worship another clue, and said unto him, What saith my Lord unto his servant? And the prince of Jehovah, the host, said unto Joshua, Put off thy shoes from off thy foot, for the place whereon thou standest is holy. And Joshua did so. And then this side note, no chapter division. Now Jericho was straitly shut up because of the children of Israel, None went out, and none came in. And Jehovah said unto Joshua. You see the continuation of a conversation that is just happening in the previous chapter. But if you've read that in a Bible a daily Bible reading, and you stop at chapter 5, and tomorrow morning you pick up in chapter 6, you almost kind of think, okay, now we're talking about two separate occasions here. No, we're not. So it helps us sometimes to see these things, but I thought we might point out regarding the chapter divisions and how sometimes they can be helpful, because then we can remember what chapter we're supposed to be in and what chapter we're not, as opposed to sometimes when they should continue. And there are other examples like that. So we have this chapter 6. We have this account of Jericho, which we're all very familiar with. In this conversation that has begun between Joshua and Jehovah. Jehovah says to Joshua, I've given into thy hand Jericho and the king thereof and the mighty men of valor, and you shall compass the city, all the men of war. And we know the preparation that's going to be made here. For the next 6 days, once this has begun to be carried out, one time per day. What's going to happen? Well, it shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, verse 5, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat. That's the seventh day. Prior to that, what's he say? For 6 days, all the men shall compass the city, verse 3, all the men of war going about the city once. And you have the people even told over these 6 days, when this happens, what are they to do in regard to saying anything? They're not. They're to play the quiet game, we may say, for 6 days. Because there'll come a time when, again, on the seventh day, they'll be given instruction in regard to shouting. So Joshua then calls the priests in verse 6, take up the Ark of the Covenant. We didn't say much about that last week, but again, we got to stop for a second, because the Ark of the Covenant to the people represents, when they would look at that, what's the thought? If we're back in that time and we see the Ark of the Covenant, what's going to come into our minds every time we actually would see it or our attention is drawn to it? Who would come to our mind? The presence of God. And so if we even go back, and didn't mention it last week, but you think about how they're told to stay so far away from it, and as they went across, as the Ark of the Covenant being carried, as those priests stepped into the waters of the Jordan, however far they stepped in, the waters parted, and of course you have then the people focusing on, wow, look what the presence of God in the form of this Ark of the Covenant, look at the power here. Well, this is only continuing. Now it's just going to be carried for 6 days, one time per day, and on the seventh day, 7 times. You have that same presence that's been with them all along, being carried around the city. Take up the Ark of the Covenant, verse 6. Let the 7 priests that bear 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the Ark of Jehovah. And they said unto the people, pass on, and compass the city. So it was so, verse 8, when Joshua spoken to the people, the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before Jehovah passed on, blew the trumpets, and the Ark of the Covenant of Jehovah followed them. So you begin to try to envision. I don't have a picture for Jericho. We don't have anything, but I can just sort of envision some city like that over in those lands with this huge wall. It's high, unbelievable. We've been given this instruction that we're just a part of the children of Israel. This is how we're going to conquer this city. And so I'm kind of beginning to think already how much faith it's going to require on all participants to carry out this command of God in regard to how we're going to conquer this city. I also might venture out and begin to think about how I feel if I'm a resident of Jericho and I'm watching from the wall, or I'm reporting daily back from the wall. We were scared at first, so much so that the gates have been shut. Nobody's going in. Nobody's coming out. We've heard about these people. We think pretty much at some point in time in the near future, they're going to siege the city like people do in battle. And so we're watching for signs of this. We're hoping the walls are going to be thick and high enough to protect us. And then we begin to see this procession on a daily basis. What happens once, you can imagine if you're the head of the household and you go back home and wife's at home, got the children at home, and she says, well, what happened today? Well, they marched around the city. There was some, blowing of horns and something, some kind of, I don't know what it was, but these guys carrying this funny looking box around. And then what? Well, they just went home. What did the people do? They didn't say anything. They were just quiet. Okay. Second day, guess what he comes on and says? Same thing I told you yesterday. Third day, now it's starting to get on his nerves. It's just exactly like it's been the last 2 days. I'll tell you if anything changes. You have all this going on, right? With the children of Israel, you think about them going home every day. Well, what are we going to do tomorrow? We're going to do the same thing tomorrow. Really? This is how we're going to conquer this city? Yep. Joshua commanded people in verse 10, saying, if you shall not shout, nor let your voice be heard, neither shall any word proceed out of your mouth until the day I bid you to shout. Then you shall shout. So, verse 12, you rose up early in the morning. The priest took the ark of Jehovah, 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets before the ark. They continually blew the trumpets. Armed men went out before them. You got this part coming up behind them, blowing the trumpets as they went. Second day, same thing. Until we came to the 7th day, and they rose up at the dawning of the day. They compassed the city in the same manner as the previous time. So you begin to think if you're a resident, if you're someone reporting from the city of Jericho, it's day 7. What do you expect to happen on day 7? The same thing that's happened in the previous 6 days. It's not like you're getting mail. It's not like somebody's reporting what's going on in the events of, they're the enemy. And so then this begins to happen, and they go around once, and you're just kind of twiddling your fingers thinking, well, here we go. They're going to go home. Everybody's going to be quiet. And all of a sudden, they just keep circling. They circle again. A second time. A third time. 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. And then Joshua says, shout, verse 16 at the end, for Jehovah had given you the city. So you have this in these additional instructions on the 7th day. On the 7th day, when the priest blew the trumpets, Joshua said, shout, and the instruction is given regarding the things in the city. Everything that's in the city is devoted. It belongs to God. And the last of the instructions, Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all that are with her in the house, because of what she did. She hid the messengers that we sent. You keep yourself from the devoted things in verse 18. But the silver, verse 19, the gold, the vessels of brass and iron, they're holy unto Jehovah. They shall come into the treasury of Jehovah. So the people shouted. The priest blew the trumpets. When the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout. And exactly as had been told, exactly as God had said, the walls fell down flat. And we see that verse 21 tells us they utterly destroyed all that was in the city. 22 just gives us some additional details in regards to what happens to Rahab, how she is saved. 2 men, the men that had spied out the city, the same 2 men that she hid, go because they know exactly where she's at. And they go and they are told to bring out the woman and all that she hath, as you swear to her. And so they went, they brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brethren, and all that she had, all her kindred, they brought out also. I said something to you last week in regarding to Rahab and her salvation. But I wanted you to think regarding the grace of God, also the works. Was Rahab, question number 1, saved by God's grace? Absolutely.
Even God's grace destroyed Jericho too, by his word, not by anything the Israelites did, but by obedience to what he said. That's when it happened.
Exactly. In regard to Rahab, we all agree that God's grace saved Rahab. Grace was extended to Rahab when Joshua sent 2 spies into Jericho to spy out the city. And there happened to be a woman there, and she had enough faith at that point in her life that she was a believer in God. She didn't know a whole lot, but she knew enough that she acted upon that, preserved these 2 men, made them pledge to her, hey, when this happens, save us. Had God not sent 2 men into the city of Jericho, and the instruction was simply to Joshua, you go 6 times, 1 time every day, 7th day, 7 times, wall's going to fall flat, utterly to destroy the city. What happens? Everybody dies. She's saved by grace. Was Rahab also saved by works? Yes. What did she have to do? Do you remember specifically what she had to do in regard to the window that she let them out of? She had to put that. She had to obey that, did she not? Let's say they give her that instruction. And we talked about how she may procrastinate. So, you know what, I need to get around to that, but I'm busy. In fact, I'm going to get to that next week. Or sooner or later. And all of a sudden the walls are falling down flat. And guess what? No cord in the window. No salvation. Grace and works. It is a common thread from beginning to end. You and I, if we are saved at all, we are saved by God's grace. But there are works of God that one must do in order to be saved. Brother George, did you raise your hand? I'm sorry, I thought I might have seen your finger. They burnt the city with fire in verse 24, all that was therein. Rahab the harlot in verse 25, her household, Joshua saved alive. And the result of that, she becomes a part of the people in the midst of Israel unto this day, because she hid the messengers that Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. You have that even alluded to, the Hebrew writer. You probably remember that. Chapter 11, verse 30, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been compassed about for 7 days. By faith Rahab the harlot perished not with them that were disobedient, having received the spies with peace. Can you imagine being of the household of Rahab? Thought about that for a moment? You're the mother, you're the father, you're a sibling, you're a cousin. After those 2 spies leave, she comes to you. And she says, this is what's going to happen in regards to this city. But if you'll stay with me, in my part of our house on this wall, when it happens, the God of Israel, the God of these people, will be saved. Can you imagine being the one that hears that? Now how is this going to happen? We're supposed to do what? And yet that's exactly what happened in that regard. And then you have Joshua charging with an oath in verse 26, very interestingly, cursed be the man before Jehovah that riseth up and buildeth this city Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn shall he lay the foundation thereof, and with the loss of his youngest son shall he set up the gates of it. And when we get to 1 Kings chapter 16, we will see that come to place. And Jehovah was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. Anything in regards to Jericho? Yes, Sister Julie.
I don't know if you mentioned this earlier or not, but Rahab was in the lineage of Christ.
That's right.
In Matthew 1 and verse 5.
So she brings up then an additional question. Rahab, one of how many women mentioned in the Bible in regards to the lineage of Christ? You already got one. Are you still in Matthew? What does it read? Ruth. You're going to have to speak louder. Yes, but she will be mentioned. That's correct. I'm looking at verse 3. Judah begat Perez and Zerah of who? They were twins. Tamar. She was his, what relationship was she to Judah? Daughter-in-law. Rahab, we've just mentioned. Ruth, and then someone whose name isn't mentioned, but it's at the end of verse 6, and we know who she is. Bathsheba, the one who had been the wife of Uriah. Those 4, and then of course you have Mary, the mother of Jesus. Very good question, very good observation there. So again, as we had noted already in regards to Rahab, and again what her occupation might have been prior to this, just reminding us regarding how we ought not to look at people and draw conclusions on who or who may not be a good candidate for the gospel. The gospel is for all. Jesus came to seek and save the lost. Who is that? That's the world. Any other comments on chapter 6? Yes, George, and then Sister Bobby.
It's also interesting to note that Rahab and Ruth, that Ruth became Rahab's daughter-in-law, and that both of them were not originally Hebrew.
Great observation. Again, what that helps us to see is that the God of Israel, the God who made the promise to Abraham, who preserved a remnant throughout this Old Testament, the Lord, second person in the Godhead, who was so interested in that preservation, but sooner or later he would be born of Mary. That does not mean that the rest of the people living during these Old Testament times were of no concern whatsoever to God. Jesus is going to die on a cross for them as much as he was going to die for the people who were this chosen race. Yes, Brother George.
I was just, when it comes to numbers in the Bible, it's interesting to note sometimes in verse 4 when you go back, the 7 priests, 7 trumpets, seventh day, 7 times, and you go through things like that, and when you get into Revelations, you see numbers and things like that, and sometimes it translates into where people think today, or in this present world, the number 7 is a lucky number, and things like that. They pick up on that kind of stuff. But we do see a lot of significance in numbers, and it's interesting sometimes to take note of that.
It is. And in regards to when it happened in Old Testament times like here, there's nothing to give us any indication at that point in time that it meant anything to them. But it is interesting that by the time you have those letters and you have John penning the book of Revelation, that absolutely symbolically meant something to those people then. And if they could then look back and want to look at some of these earlier things, or us who have the completed word, then we're going, oh, that's not just some random number chosen for there, especially in light of what would come later. Very good. Yes, sir.
In the New Testament, Christ is criticized for working on the Sabbath. It appears to me that they marched around on the Sabbath.
They sure did. Based upon whose command? That's exactly right. You make a point. You make a valid point. It's just not yours. It's just invalid in regards to this particular instruction on this day, because God and His command overrode anything previous and anything later on this specific day.
And I think that's what Christ was trying to get across to them.
He was. He was Lord of the Sabbath. That's exactly right. No doubt. Good. Well, see, I was totally wrong about the Wednesday and Sunday morning take. All right. Chapter 7. But the children of Israel committed a trespass in the devoted thing. For Achan took of the devoted thing. So you have that little side note. Because the next thing that's happening is there is some city called Ai. And Joshua sends men from Jericho to Ai. That's the next city in line to be conquered. Go up, spy out the land. The men went up and spied out the land. They come back. There is no reason, based upon our observation, that all the people should go up. In fact, how many are we going to need? 2,000 or 3,000. Let's just send a few. And so Joshua says, okay, there went up thither the people about 3,000 men. And the next thing the Bible says in regards to 3,000 men is they're doing what? We have an expression. They're running for their lives. And the men of Ai smote of them about 36 men. I could be wrong, and I'll be more than happy when you point it out to me. I don't know of another occasion in which the children of Israel fought a battle that the Bible says anything specifically about how many men died in the battle. Here we have a specific number given, 36. Now I'm beginning to try to just keep in mind why these 36 men have died. Not only these 36 men, but who were they related to? How did that affect them when they came back running for their lives? Because they've been defeated, and the hearts of the people melted. It became as water. Joshua rent his clothes. He fell to the earth upon his face before the ark of Jehovah until the evening. We see that the elders of Israel, they put dust upon their heads. And then we have Joshua speaking, O Lord Jehovah, wherefore hast thou at all brought this people over the Jordan to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites, to cause us to perish? Would that we had been content and dwelt beyond the Jordan. O Lord, what shall I say after that Israel hath turned their backs from before their enemies? For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear of it, will compass us round, cut off our name from the earth. And what wilt thou do for thy great name? What happens to Joshua here? I mean, think about what has just previously happened, whose presence he had been in not too long prior, a conversation he has had with who? God. And now what? What happens to Joshua in this moment?
Like he fell apart over nothing.
Like he fell apart, seemingly we may say over nothing. We might say that. The only reason I'd say that it's not over nothing is because there are things that happen in our lives sometimes seemingly. Someone may look at those and say over nothing, and yet because it is our Goliath, it is a giant, we fight, we crumble. And then not only does he fall apart, seemingly, what about his words in verse 7? What happens with what he says in this moment? If you're reading that and you know the big picture, how do you view Joshua's words in verse 7? Kind of like I want to go back to Egypt. He says something about, hey, we could have been content, just stayed on the other side of the river. Plenty of room over there. Be crowded with the Reubenites and half the tribe of Manasseh and Gad, but we could all fit. What else do you see? It's something that really we ought to get because it happens to us.
He doesn't,
Lapse of faith.
he doesn't, he puts it forward to God like, have you done this? Like, he's not taking into account that maybe they've done something that caused God to turn.
Okay, somebody
Forsaken.
forsaken. I mean, doesn't he just speak almost like out of his mind? Isn't it almost like when you read his words going, well, Josh, how could you even say such a thing? Are you forgetting what God has done for you up to this point? And yet, in an emotional moment, when we're up against something, we may shout out. We may shout out to the very one we love more than anybody in this world and say something so out of character in the moment. Something that when we look back a week or two later or a year, because it still sticks with us because we can't forget it, we can't take the words back, we're going, how on earth did I ever say that? What on earth possessed me? It's that kind of moment. I point it out because it happens. It happened to him. We're talking about a great leader. We're talking about the one that has been charged with stepping in the shoes of a brilliant leader. And he is going to be a great leader. He is going to be a great conqueror in the land that they are to conquer. And yet in this moment, he speaks out of character. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I was just thinking, it sounds to me like he's just confused. It's like God had been with him up until now. Why did he let this happen? It sounds to me like he's just confused.
There's no doubt that he is. But in all honesty, I would say go ahead a month in his life and have him look back at everything that's happened since they came out of Egypt. Clothes never wore out. Shoes never wore out. Manna was there 6 days a week. Sometimes we got meat. We've been preserved. We crossed over the Red Sea on dry ground. We crossed over the Jordan on dry ground. All I got to do is just start putting all these things together back, right? And seemingly, I hear your point, but seemingly the confusion ought to go away really quick. But we have an adversary, and let's not forget that just because we have to put up with him and try to conquer him here and now, that he's not back during these days trying to somehow produce doubt in the minds of even Joshua. Because if he can bring Joshua down, who else does he bring down? Everybody. They're all looking to him. Yes, sir.
Well, I think she's right, and you're right both. It's out of that confusion comes the out of character moment, because instead of asking the question, what have we done?
Yeah.
He's asking God, why haven't you done?
That's right.
And even though he doesn't understand there has been a sin yet, there still could have been that connection if he thought it through, that we must have done something different than what God told us to do.
Exactly right. Thus, the next verse. Jehovah said unto Joshua, I understand what you're feeling. And as far as I'm concerned, you can just stay in that state. No. What's he telling? Get up. Brother George.
Sylvia had a comment.
Sister Sylvia. Did you?
Well, I was just gonna make the statement that he even seems a little arrogant and angry, really angry about it. You know, here he is talking to the Lord, not
Yeah.
like that.
I appreciate everything that we're thinking in regard to Joshua. My point would be just for us to understand that, again, in any moment of time, Joshua's behavior might be yours or mine at any point in time. And I suspect it's been something that we're probably all guilty of at some point in our life. Brother Doug.
Seems to me he's on thin ice here, making these things. I mean, people have died before for having the same feelings. Like, what have you done? You brought us out of Egypt. Yeah, we don't have water, we don't have that. I mean, people have died because of that.
You bet they have. Which then maybe would remind us regarding God's grace and mercy and his long suffering, not only with Joshua, but with us as well. Get up. Wherefore art thou fallen upon thy face? Israel has sinned. And now, again, based upon the confusion that he likely felt, things are becoming more clear. Okay, now I understand why this has happened. Israel has transgressed my covenant which I commanded them. I'm thinking about how God continues to address the sin collectively, and yet we know that it really boils down to one man and likely also his family. Some involvement there. Yea, they have even transgressed my covenant, verse 11, which I commanded them. Joshua chapter 7, verse 11. Yea, they have even taken of the devoted thing and have stolen, and the American Standard says dissembled also. What does your version say? Lied. Deceived, maybe you'll have in some of your versions, deceived. And they have put it amongst their own stuff. You ever think about the stuff you have in your garage, up in your attic? Well, Israel had stuff too. People have always had stuff. What about this idea of get up? How do you see God's response to Joshua's actions? What do you see in these words, get up? Yes, George.
My first thought is, he knows the heart of Joshua, and Joshua's confused. Why have you brought us to this point? I don't know. That's just my first thought.
Okay. How about, yes.
He wants you to get up, not just physically stand up and get up and do something. Get up and get this taken care of. I mean, that command, get up, doesn't mean just stand up.
Yeah, so it just says get up and do something. I will have us note in regard to whatever Joshua struggled with in this moment in which he fell upon his knees and begins to say the things that we said, he is not reprimanded by God. You notice that? To Doug's point, I mean, you would think some people have been punished tremendously for even less, and yet God says nothing to him about it. I'm not saying God excused it. God understood who Joshua was. God understood his weakness as a man. That there would be those moments that he would fall short of his, H-I-S capital, his glory. And in response, get up. I started thinking about get thee up. I had a best friend in high school, and we had this deal when we played sports that any time one of us would get hurt, the first thing the other would say to the one who got hurt was, get up. Get up. And I remember playing a basketball game my senior year over in Rockport, and I went in for a basket, and the guy took my legs out from under me. Next thing that hit the floor was my face. I wasn't for sure what had happened, but I heard these words, get up. So I started pushing myself up, and then rolled over, and blood was going everywhere, and so I didn't get up. Not that time. But it's the same kind of idea. I started thinking about get thee up. And I started thinking about our life amongst one another, our families, our husbands, our wives, our children, our brethren. And there will come times in their life where, as we've already noted regarding Joshua, something's going to happen. And it's going to bring about a depression. It's going to bring about a discouragement. You might even be thinking about quitting the Lord. And that is when there needs to be supportive measures taken by those that are in close contact with that person and begin to see something like that happen. And in essence, when that does, you know what the words need to be from it's not like, I'm not saying we're not insensitive what's going on in their life. We are. We're not making fun of them because, what's the matter with Joshua? Why is he confused? Can't he remember all that God has done for him in this moment? Obviously not. Well, I could have the same thing happen to me. You could too. And if all I do is come in and say, well, what's the matter with you? Well, I don't know what the matter is, but obviously you're feeling a certain way for some reason. I need to encourage you as Joshua needed to be encouraged. I don't need to lay in you and say, Joshua, did you see what you said to me back in verse 7? I ought to just annihilate you. What he does. Get up. Get up. There's work to be done. So we're understanding of where someone may be. We get down right there with them. I get it. I've been there. But staying here, it's not going to work. You got to get up.
I've heard it said that discouragement is one of Satan's shiniest tools.
That's right.
Because it gets used so much, it stays shiny.
That's exactly right. No doubt, Satan conquers so many through discouragement. So that's all God's doing here is just reminding Joshua of the duty, of the charge. And then there is this statement made, Israel has sinned. And then there is this process by which that will be found out. They can't stand in verse 12. The children of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. I don't care how many they are. I don't care how small Ai is. It won't matter. I'm not with them. I will not be with you, the end of verse 12. I will not be with you anymore except you destroy the devoted thing from among you. That ought to say something in regard to God and His presence in the lives of people whose practice is sin. I didn't say people who commit sin from time to time. That's not their purpose. I'm talking about those whose practice is to sin. The practice of sin and the presence of God in that life can't exist. Can't. It's the conquering of those sins. It's that willingness to get up every morning and saying, I'm going to overcome with the help of God. Now you have the presence and the help of God based upon a determination to live godly and righteous. So you have this process by which everybody's brought forth. I began to think about this, and I have before, if I am Achan, and now this process by which how it will be determined who the person is. My heart's going to start beating. And it's just going to get closer and closer and closer till finally it's man by man. I thought about that expression, man by man. And there is a direct parallel to the judgment day. I see all you here today. I don't know how it's going to be in the judgment when we all stand before the Lord, whether or not we'll stand with one another as a congregation. We'll kind of know who was right and left. But it doesn't matter if you're right or left of me. The judgment will be about man by man. You know what I mean by that? For we must all be made manifest. That's made known. That's where our lives, in essence, are filleted open for all to see. You have nothing to fear if you're living a godly, righteous life, forgiven of your sins. Sins that can be confessed and forgiven on a daily basis. But try to hide something? Try to pretend you are somebody that you're not? Well, you will as far as this life is concerned. You'll get by with it, maybe. But not here. Manifest. We must all be made manifest before the judgment seat of Christ. Now note, man by man, that each one may receive the things done in the body according to what he hath done, whether it be good or bad. But there's some of you here today, I would love to be standing next to you in the judgment. But your presence right and left of me will not help me on that day whatsoever. You and I will give an account for the deeds done in the body. Again, we die in the Lord. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. Nothing to fear. Nothing but hope of a future in heaven someday, eternally. God, the Father, Son, Spirit, holy angels, all the faithful to the ages. How long? Eternally. Eternally. No more sickness, no more dying, no more COVID, no more difficulties, no more depression, no more nothing. That's worth working for, isn't it? Grinding for. As we continue on this marathon of life. So, again, finally, man by man, and here comes the guilty party, Achan. And Joshua says, my son, give, I pray thee, glory to Jehovah, the God of Israel. Make confession. Did he? He does. You have to give Achan credit for what he does here. And don't draw a conclusion based upon how it's going to end for Achan. I'm just getting us to think that it didn't turn out okay for Achan. I don't know where Achan is now in the eternal world. I know what he did in the end. He did as he was told to do, to make confession. And he said, I have sinned of truth, I have sinned against Jehovah, the God of Israel, and thus and thus have I done. He begins to recount it. I saw, and then I coveted. He hid them in the earth. So Joshua sends messengers. They ran to his tent. It was as he had said. They took the things that were hid in his tent. They brought them to Joshua, to all the children of Israel. They laid it before them. It's now obvious that he's done this. Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan the son of Zerah, silver, the mantle, the wedge of gold, his sons, his daughters, his oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent, all that he had, and they brought them up to the valley of Achor. And Joshua said, why hast thou troubled us? Jehovah shall trouble thee this day. And all Israel stoned him with stones. They buried them with fire and stoned them with stones. And they raised over him a great heap of stones unto this day. And Joshua turned from the fierceness of his anger. As you've read through that before, have you ever tried to consider whether the punishment that was dealt here, first of all, we may say, was it fair? Secondly, did it involve Achan only, or did it involve others in addition to Achan? Was it fair based upon the command of God given back in chapter 6? What had God said regarding the devoted things? They belong to God. What did Achan do in regard to those things? He committed a sin. He committed a sin. And the consequence of that sin was what? Death. What about his family? Seemingly. I've seen some argue that as you go through the he's and the them's and so forth and so on, that it seems like possibly that maybe the family is brought down there. They witness it, but they're not a part of it. But at some point in time, we'll get to Joshua chapter 22, and in verse 20 it says, did not Achan the son of Zerah commit a trespass in the devoted thing, and wrath fell upon all the congregation of Israel, and that man perished not alone in his iniquity. We might make the point about Achan and his sin. Innocent people may suffer because of another one's sinful actions. Did you forget about the 36 men? They lost their life because of who? Him. If what seems to be true, that they burned them, verse 25, and stoned them, verse 25, then you have again his sons and his daughters. If they were a part of that sentence that was carried out, because of other things that you know in the scriptures regarding God and the sins of the Son and the sins of the Father and how God deals with that, Ezekiel chapter 18, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. It seems to suggest, if they were a part of the sentence being carried out, that they also what? They knew about it and participated to some degree. Maybe they didn't actually take it themselves, but they knew about it and they were a part of the deception. Just something for us to consider. Yes, sister?
That's kind of what I was going to say, is they could have known that and didn't tell anybody, and thus they were just as guilty not telling anyone.
I agree.
And God had to kill them to be as a sign to everybody else, hey, this is what happens when you disobey me.
That's right. The sentence here was what it was. Yes?
You give in
Yes, and to your point, bringing it forward to us, the very best thing that we can do when caught in sin, I don't mean caught by other people, just in it. God caught us. He's seen it. The very first thing and best thing we can do, no matter the consequences, is to confess the sin as soon as we realize it's sin, no matter the consequence. Yes, sir.
I was gonna make a comment that something we can notice here is God doesn't immediately call out the sin. When it happens, he could have told Joshua, Israel has sinned, someone has taken the things which are committed to me, and had him go through all this. He could have done that immediately, but he didn't. God gave him time that he could have repented of it and come back to him. But he didn't, and it caused those people to die. And it was at that point that God said, okay, you need to go through this. So God gave him time to repent like he does with us.
He did have time. He did have time to where he maybe could have done the right thing. How that would have changed things, we don't know. We know exactly what happened here. We'll pick up with the next chapter and see how far we get next week. You've already seen probably the middle part of the book of Joshua is going to be all about divisions of the land and stuff. And so again, I can't imagine us being quite as slow through those things, but we'll see. Sometimes we find some gems and we've got to talk about it. So thank you for your attention.